The Freedom Riders were groups of civil rights activists, black and white, who participated in freedom bus rides throughout the American South. The one that I want to tell you about today began on May 4th, 1961. Now, the Supreme Court had ruled in Plessy versus Ferguson that separate but equal was lawful. That's where Jim Crow came from. However, in 1946, Morgan versus Virginia Supreme Court ruling found that segregated bus seating was in fact unconstitutional. And then another Supreme Court ruling, which came down in 1960, Boynton versus Virginia, said that segregation of interstate transportation facilities was also unconstitutional. It is that law that the Freedom Riders of 1961 would put to test. The 1961 Freedom Rides were organized by the Congress of Racial Equality, and they were modeled after the 1947 Journey of Reconciliation, which was another freedom ride. That ride was organized to test the 1946 U.S. Supreme Court decision, which was Morgan v. Virginia, that found that segregated bus seating was, in fact, unconstitutional. Now, the big difference between the 1947 Journey of Reconciliation and the 1961 Freedom Rides was the inclusion of women in the later initiative. So in both actions, black riders traveled to the Jim Crow South, where segregation continued despite the Supreme Court rulings, and they attempted to use whites-only restrooms, lunch counters, and waiting rooms. So the original group of Freedom Riders in May of 1961 was 13 Freedom Riders. 7 were African Americans, 6 were white. They left Washington, D.C. on a Greyhound bus. Their plan was to reach New Orleans, Louisiana on May 17th. And that was to commemorate the 7th anniversary of the Supreme Court ruling Brown versus Board of Education, which ruled that segregation in the nation's public schools was unconstitutional. Among these 13 riders was none other than the late Honorable John Lewis. So the group traveled through Virginia, North Carolina, drawing very little public notice. First violence occurred on May 12th in a little town called Rock Hill, South Carolina. John Lewis, who was an African-American seminary student at the time, and a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, with a white freedom rider who was a World War II veteran named Albert Bigelow, and another black rider. They were viciously attacked as they attempted to enter a whites-only waiting area. The next day, the group reached Atlanta and they diverged. In Atlanta, Georgia, some of the riders split off onto a Trailways bus. So now there was a Greyhound bus and a Trailways bus with half of the group on each bus. On May 14th, 1961, the Greyhound bus was the first to arrive in a little town called Anniston, Alabama. There was an angry mob, about 200 white people surrounded the bus, and it was so much of a brouhaha that the bus driver didn't stop at the station. He continued on past the bus station. However, the mob followed the bus in automobiles and trucks and whatnot, and they managed to blow out the tires. Then someone threw a bomb on the bus. And when the bus came to a stop, they blocked the door so that the Freedom Riders were not able to get off. But they did escape the bus as it burst into flames. Now, they escaped the bus only to be brutally beaten by members of the surrounding mob. The second bus, the Trailways bus, it traveled to Birmingham, Alabama, and those riders were also beaten by an angry mob, many of whom brandished metal pipes. Now, the Birmingham Public Safety Commission officer, his name was Bull Connor. He stated that although he knew that the Freedom Riders were arriving and that he knew that violence awaited them, he posted no police protection at the station because, in his words, it was Mother's Day. Photographs of the burning Greyhound bus in Anniston and the bloody riders appeared on the front pages of newspapers throughout the country and around the world the next day. It drew international attention to the Freedom Riders' cause and the state of race relations in the United States. Now, my mother's from Anniston, Alabama, and as a little girl, she tells me she remembers hearing about the bus that was set on fire, right outside of town. Following the widespread violence, the Congress for Racial Equality officials, they couldn't find another bus driver to agree to transport the groups on the remaining portion of the journey. So the Freedom Ride was at a pause. It was almost abandoned. However, a young lady named Diane Nash, now she was an activist with the Students for Nonviolent Coordination Committee. She organized another group from Nashville, Tennessee, to continue the rides. Then the U.S. Attorney General, who was Robert F. Kennedy at the time, brother of President John F. Kennedy, began negotiating with the governor of Alabama. His name was John Patterson, and the bus companies, and they secured a driver and state protection for the new group of Freedom Riders to continue the trip. So the rides finally resumed on a Greyhound bus departing from Birmingham under police escort on the 20th of May. The violence toward the Freedom Riders, however, was not quelled. Rather, the police escort they had abandoned the Greyhound bus just before it arrived at Montgomery, Alabama. And at the bus terminal, there was a mob of people who attacked the riders with baseball bats and clubs as they disembarked. The Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, then sent 600 federal marshals to the city to stop the violence. That's how bad it got. On May 24th, 1961, a group of Freedom Riders departed Montgomery for Jackson, Mississippi, to continue the journey. There, several hundred protesters greeted the riders. Also, several hundred supporters greeted the riders. However, those who attempted to use the whites-only facilities were arrested for trespassing and taken to maximum security penitentiary in Parchman, Mississippi. Maximum security for trespassing charge. That same day, the U.S. Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, issued a statement urging a cooling off period. Now, during the Mississippi hearings, the judge, who now had to hear the case of all of these arrested for trespassing, turned and looked at the wall rather than to hear and look at the Freedom Riders as they presented their defense. The same thing had been done when sit-in participants were arrested for protesting segregated lunch counters in Tennessee. He sentenced all of the riders to 30 days in jail. Then attorneys from the NAACP, they appealed these convictions, and they appealed them all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court reversed them. Now, desegregating travel in the South was a long and treacherous road. The violence and the arrests continued to garner national and international attention and drew hundreds of new riders to the cause. The rides continued over the next several months, even into the fall of 1961, and finally, under pressure from the Kennedy administration, the Interstate Commerce Commission issued regulations prohibiting the segregation of interstate transit terminals. Just 13 people left Washington, D.C. in May of 1961 to bring about this sweeping change in the law that is interstate travel in America. Despise not small beginnings. So, anytime you see injustice, everywhere you see injustice, Doesn't matter how big or how small your contingent is, when you walk through and walk forth in the truth, eventually I believe you will prevail. So that is the story of the 1961 Freedom Riders who left 1100 New York Avenue in Washington, D.C. on a Greyhound bus in search of justice. You can find Black history anywhere because Black history is everywhere.
If you would like to receive more videos like this, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification icon to receive our new releases. If you would like to assist Truth Be Told in our mission to preserve African American history, which is American history, please share this video with your children, family, and friends. Truth Be Told, you can find Black history anywhere because our history is everywhere.